The celestial body designated as PX-4419 did not hang in the void like a predictable marble of silicate and ice, but rather loomed as a jagged splinter of absolute darkness against the shimmering veil of the Perseus Arm. It was a rogue world, untethered from any parent star, drifting through the interstellar medium with a gravity that felt predatory rather than passive. Within the cramped, vibrating hull of the long-range scout vessel Vanguard of Inquiry, Commander Aris Thulon watched the telemetry feeds with a focused intensity that bordered on the obsessive. The ship's interior smelled of recycled oxygen, scorched copper, and the lingering scent of synthetic nutrient paste. Thulon's hands, weathered by decades of proximity to high-energy radiation shielding, moved with practiced fluidity over the touch-sensitive control surfaces, adjusting the dampeners as the ship began its descent into the planet's deceptively thin atmosphere. Beside him sat the lead xenobiologist, Vespera Solari, whose eyes were fixed on the thermal imaging scanners which showed heat blooms pulsing deep beneath the planet's obsidian crust. They were far beyond the charted territories of the unified conglomerate, seeking the source of a signal that defied every known law of quantum entanglement. The signal was not a broadcast in the traditional sense. It was a rhythmic displacement of spacetime itself, a heartbeat felt in the marrow of their bones rather than heard through their headsets. As the Vanguard breached the upper ionosphere, the hull groaned under the sudden onset of gravimetric shear, a violent reminder that PX-4419 possessed a core far more massive than its physical dimensions suggested. The descent was a chaotic symphony of rattling bulkheads and the shrill whine of atmospheric friction. Unlike gas giants or rocky terrestrials, this world was coated in a layer of metallic glass that reflected nothing, absorbing the ship's scanning lasers as if they were being fired into a bottomless well. Thulon fought the controls, his muscles tensing as the inertial dampeners struggled to compensate for a series of erratic magnetic pulses emanating from the surface. He steered the vessel toward a vast, hexagonal depression that appeared on the topographical radar as a rare break in the jagged mountain ranges of frozen methane. Vespera gripped the arms of her command chair, her knuckles white, watching the external cameras feed a grainy, monochromatic view of the approaching terrain. There were no lights on the surface, no cities or outposts, only the endless shimmering expanse of the obsidian plains. Yet, as they dropped below the cloud layer, a swirling mist of suspended carbon nanotubes, the sensors began to register structured geometry. Massive pylons, each several kilometers high, rose from the ground like the ribcage of a fossilized titan. These structures were not built. They appeared to have grown, crystallized from the very bedrock in patterns that suggested a mathematics far removed from human understanding. The ship cleared the final layer of haze, and the landing site came into view, a perfectly flat obsidian dais large enough to house a small city, situated at the confluence of three massive tectonic rifts. As the landing struts made contact with the surface, a sound like a tolling bell reverberated through the ship's frame, a deep, resonant vibration that caused the internal lights to flicker and then stabilize at a lower, amber frequency. Thulon initiated the power-down sequence, though he kept the fusion core at a low-level idle, unwilling to fully commit to the stillness of this alien world. The silence that followed the engine cutoff was heavy, a physical weight that pressed against their eardrums. Vespera was the first to speak, her voice a hushed rasp in the small cabin, noting that the external temperature was barely above absolute zero, yet the atmospheric pressure was nearly identical to Earth's at sea level. This paradox suggested a sophisticated level of environmental engineering, a planetary-scale field that maintained conditions against the natural entropy of deep space. They began the arduous process of donning their environmental suits, complex exoskeletons designed to withstand extreme cold and high-energy particle bombardment. Every movement was deliberate, a ritual of seals, latches, and oxygen checks. They knew that once they stepped out onto the dais, they would be the first biological entities to touch this soil in potentially millions of years. The airlock cycled with a series of rhythmic thumps, the inner door sliding shut with a finality that felt like a sentence being passed. When the outer hatch finally retracted, the view was breathtaking and terrifying in equal measure. The sky above PX 4419 was a tapestry of distant nebulae, violet and crimson smears against the void, but the horizon was dominated by the monolithic pylons. Up close, the obsidian surface was not smooth, but etched with billions of microscopic grooves, creating a texture that seemed to flow like liquid when viewed from certain angles. Thulun stepped onto the ramp, his boots clanking against the metal, and then he transitioned onto the alien stone. The ground felt unnaturally solid, devoid of any vibration or give. He looked back at Vespera, who was emerging with a handheld sensor array, its glowing screen casting a soft blue light on her visor. They began to walk toward the center of the dais, their movements slow and cautious. Every few meters, Thulun would stop to plant a beacon, a small silver spike that would maintain their link to the Vanguard's main computer. The air outside was perfectly still, yet the sensors indicated a constant flow of ionized gas moving in complex patterns around the pylons. It was as if the planet itself was breathing, using the structures as giant lungs to cycle energy from the vacuum of space. As they approached the center of the dais, the ground began to slope downward, revealing a circular aperture that spiraled into the depths of the planet like the iris of a gargantuan eye. The aperture was not a hole but a staircase, or rather, a series of descending platforms that hovered without visible support. Thulun peered into the depths, his helmet lights cutting a path through the dark. The beams traveled for hundreds of meters before being swallowed by the gloom, revealing walls lined with glowing, translucent veins of some unknown mineral. These veins pulsed with a faint, rhythmic light, synchronized with the gravimetric signal they had followed from the edge of the system. Vespera knelt at the edge of the opening, her sensors detecting a surge in bioelectric signatures coming from below. It wasn't life as they knew it, not carbon-based or cellular, but a complex arrangement of crystalline processes and energy-conducting filaments. They were standing on the threshold of a planetary-sized computer, or perhaps a tomb, or a nursery. The choice to descend was immediate. They hadn't traveled across the light years to stand on the porch of the unknown. Thulun adjusted his tether and began the descent, his magnetic boots clicking onto the first floating platform. The sensation was disorienting, as the gravity seemed to shift with every step, pulling him toward the center of the shaft. Vespera followed, her equipment humming as it recorded the data of a lifetime. The descent took hours, a grueling journey through a vertical labyrinth of geometric precision. Deep within the crust, the air temperature began to rise, the suit's cooling systems kicking in to compensate. The walls of the shaft opened up into a cavern of such immense proportions that their lights could no longer find the ceiling. Below them lay a sea of liquid mercury, or something that mimicked its sheen, perfectly still and reflective. Floating above this metallic ocean were thousands of crystalline spheres, each the size of a house, drifting in a slow, choreographed dance. These spheres were the source of the pulses, they were translucent, and inside each one, Thulun could see flickering shapes that resembled neural networks, firing with bursts of golden light. It was a library of consciousness, a repository of minds preserved in a state of suspended calculation. Thulun felt a surge of vertigo, realizing that they were looking at the remnants of a civilization that had transcended the need for biology, choosing instead to live within the architecture of their world. As he reached the final platform, just meters above the Mercury Sea, a bridge of solidified light extended from the nearest pylon, inviting them toward a central hub that glowed with an intensity that rivaled a small sun. They stepped onto the bridge, the light firm beneath their feet, and walked toward the heart of the obsidian world, unaware that their arrival had already triggered a sequence of events that would alter the course of human history forever. The central hub was a chamber of mirrors, though the reflections were not of themselves, but of possible versions of the room, shifting and changing with every second. In the center stood a pedestal of carved ivory-colored stone, the only thing in this dark world that wasn't obsidian. Resting upon it was a simple geometric shape, a dodecahedron that seemed to pull the light from the room into its facets. As Thulon approached, the dodecahedron began to rotate, and a voice, not sound, but a direct injection of thought into his mind, filled his consciousness. It did not speak in words, but in concepts: origin, entropy, preservation, witness. Thulon gasped, stumbling back as the sheer weight of the information threatened to overwhelm his cognitive functions. Vespera caught him, her own expression one of shock, as she too felt the telepathic intrusion. The spheres in the cavern began to glow brighter, their collective hum rising to a crescendo that vibrated in their teeth. The planet was waking up. The signal they had followed was not a distress call or a beacon. It was a heartbeat, and they had just stepped into the center of the chest. The dodecahedron opened like a flower, revealing a core of pure energy that pulsed with the same rhythm as the planet's gravity. It was a key, and the lock was the very ship they had left on the surface. They realized then that PX 4419 was not a destination, but a vessel, and they were the unintended catalysts for its next voyage. Thulon struggled to regain his composure, his mind racing to process the implications of the entity's communication. This wasn't just a machine, it was a collective intelligence, the synthesized essence of a race that had seen the birth of the galaxy and feared its eventual heat death. The dodecahedron was an interface, a way for the planetary mind to interact with the physical world. Vespera moved toward the pedestal, her curiosity momentarily overriding her fear. She reached out a gloved hand, her fingers trembling as they neared the glowing core. As she touched the energy, a holographic projection erupted from the pedestal, filling the chamber with a map of the universe that was unlike any Thulon had ever seen. It showed the movement of galaxies over billions of years, the rise and fall of civilizations like flickering sparks in the night. One spark, brighter than the rest, represented the UC territories, and it was being approached by a shadow, a wave of void that consumed everything in its path. The message was clear: a threat was coming, something that even this ancient intelligence could not stop alone, and the obsidian world was the only refuge. The realization hit Thulon like a physical blow. They weren't just explorers, they were the harbingers of a coming storm, and their discovery of PX 4419 was the first step in a desperate plan for survival. The floor beneath them began to vibrate again, but this time it was different, a steady, rhythmic thrum that indicated the planet's engines were engaging. The mercury sea below started to swirl, forming a massive vortex that pulled the crystalline spheres toward the center. Thulon knew they had to get back to the vanguard. If the planet moved, they would be trapped here, millions of light years from home, in a world that was effectively a giant lifeboat. He grabbed Vespera's arm, pulling her back from the pedestal. They ran for the floating platforms, their movements fueled by adrenaline. The ascent was even more difficult than the descent, the shifting gravity making every step a gamble. Above them, the aperture was closing, the obsidian iris narrowing as the planet's defensive shields began to power up. They reached the final platform and scrambled onto the dais just as the Vanguard's external sensors began to scream a warning of massive gravimetric shifts. The sky above was no longer a tapestry of nebulae, it was a blur of distorted light as the planet entered a state of transdimensional flux. They sprinted for the ship, the air around them crackling with static electricity. As they reached the airlock, Thulon looked back one last time at the monolithic pylons. They were glowing now, a deep, resonant violet that matched the color of the void wave they had seen in the projection. The entire planet was a masterpiece of engineering, a testament to a species that refused to go quietly into the night. They hauled themselves inside the Vanguard, the inner door slamming shut with a reassuring thud. Thulon dove into the pilot's seat, his fingers flying across the console as he initiated the emergency takeoff sequence. The ship's engines roared to life, but instead of the usual push of acceleration, they felt a strange, weightless pull. The Vanguard wasn't lifting off the planet, it was being integrated into its field. The ship's systems began to merge with the planet's network, the screens displaying data in a language that Thulon could suddenly understand. They weren't leaving PX 4419, they were becoming a part of it. The chapter of their lives as simple explorers was over, and the era of the obsidian voyage had begun. The ship's hull hummed in harmony with the planet's heart, and as the world slipped into the fold between dimensions, Thulon and Vespera prepared themselves for a journey into the very heart of the coming darkness, knowing that the secrets they had uncovered were only the beginning of a much larger, more terrifying truth. The Vanguard was no longer just a ship, it was a sensory organ for the planet mind. Through the interface, Thulon could feel the vastness of the obsidian world, its deep tectonic layers, its crystalline processes, its ancient memories. He saw the history of the species that had built it, a race of poets and engineers who had watched their own sun die and refused to perish with it. They had turned their world into a vessel, a sanctuary for their collective consciousness, and had waited in the void for someone to find them. Someone like Thulon and Vespera. The connection was overwhelming, a flood of emotion and knowledge that threatened to drown their individual identities. Vespera sat in her chair, her eyes closed, her mind intertwined with the planetary library. She was seeing the formulas for the transdimensional drive, the secrets of zero-point energy, the very blueprints of reality. They were no longer just two humans in a small ship. They were the bridge between the past and the future, the keepers of a legacy that could save their own kind. But as the planet moved through the fold, Thulon felt a cold, sharp presence, a flicker of malice in the dark. The void wave was not just a natural phenomenon, it was a predator, and it had noticed the obsidian world's sudden activity. The chase had begun. Thulon gripped the control yoke, though it was now more of a symbolic gesture than a functional one. The planet was steering itself, navigating the complex currents of the subspace manifold with a precision that no human pilot could ever hope to match. Yet he could feel the strain on the planetary systems, the way the pylons hummed with the effort of maintaining the dimensional shield. The shadow they had seen in the projection was closer than they had realized, a vast, hungry entity that fed on the energy of entire star systems. It was the antithesis of the obsidian world, destruction versus preservation, entropy versus order. Thulon realized that their mission had changed from one of discovery to one of survival. They had to reach the UC territories before the void wave did, to warn their people and prepare them for the coming conflict. But the path was long, and the enemy was fast. The Vanguard's sensors, now amplified by the planet's power, detected a series of ripples in the manifold behind them. Something was following them, something that didn't belong in this space between spaces. It was a fragment of the void wave, a scout or a parasite, and it was gaining ground. Vespera opened her eyes, her gaze sharp and clear despite the mental strain. She looked at Thulon, and he saw a new determination in her expression. She had seen the solution in the library, a way to use the planet's unique properties to create a weapon or at least a distraction. But it would require a sacrifice, a piece of the planet's own core. They had to decide, protect the legacy of the ancients or use it to save the future of humanity. The weight of the decision was immense, but as the shadow behind them grew larger, the choice became clear. They were the inheritors of this world, and its purpose was to preserve life, in whatever form it took. Thulon nodded, a silent agreement passing between them. They began to work, their hands moving in perfect synchronization with the planet's systems. The obsidian world groaned as it prepared for the confrontation, the violet light of the pylons intensifying until it was blinding. The first chapter of their journey was closing, and the real battle was about to begin. The void wave was upon them, a wall of absolute nothingness that threatened to consume the light of the stars. But the obsidian world was not just a sanctuary, it was a fortress, and its guardians were ready. The transition from the fluid geometry of the subspace manifold back into the harsh reality of the local stellar neighborhood was a violent convulsion that nearly sheared the vanguard of inquiry from its external moorings on the obsidian dais. As the planetary scale displacement field collapsed, PX 4419 re-emerged into the physical universe near the periphery of the Uit cloud of a dying red dwarf star. The sudden return of standard gravitational constants caused the ship's internal compensators to shriek in protest, and Thulan felt the familiar, grounding weight of his own body return with a bruising force. Outside the reinforced viewports, the star, a bloated crimson sphere of sputtering plasma, cast long, bloody shadows across the hexagonal plains of the planet. Vespera Solari was already leaning over her console, her fingers dancing across the translucent interface that now shimmered with a mixture of human code and ancient alien symbology. The connection to the planet mind had not severed. It had merely shifted into a background hum, a constant data stream that fed directly into the ship's auxiliary processors. She reported that the void wave fragment, that sliver of predatory entropy that had pursued them through the fold, had been momentarily displaced by the transition, but the gravimetric wake it left behind was still visible on the long-range scans. It was a wound in the fabric of space, a jagged tear that refused to heal, and it was expanding. The interior of the Vanguard had begun to undergo a subtle, disconcerting transformation. The metallic walls were now interlaced with fine, pulsing veins of the same obsidian material that coated the planet below. These filaments acted as a neural bridge, allowing the ship to draw power directly from the planet's zero-point vacuum stabilizers. Thulan checked the proximity sensors and realized they were not alone in this desolate system. Ghostly echoes appeared on the radar, flickering in and out of existence near the inner planets. These were not ships of the unified conglomerate, nor were they any known pirate vessels. They were derelicts, ancient husks of silver and bone-white alloy that drifted in a graveyard orbit around the red dwarf. Vespera's eyes widened as she analyzed the spectral signatures of the wreckage. These ships belonged to a civilization that predated the conglomerate by millennia, yet their design shared a clear genetic lineage with the architecture of the obsidian world. This was a rallying point, a place where the builders of PX 4419 had once gathered their fleets before the Great Silence took them. The planet had brought them here for a reason, likely to scavenge for the specific components needed to activate the planetary weapon Vespera had glimpsed in the library. Thulan initiated a short-range pulse to map the largest of the derelicts, a massive, spindle-shaped cruiser that lay broken in half like a discarded toy. The scan revealed a pressurized internal bay that still held a faint trace of breathable atmosphere and, more importantly, a functional high-capacity tachyon emitter. This was the missing piece they needed to amplify the planet's defensive grid into a focused beam of anti-entropic energy. He looked at Vespera, seeing the exhaustion etched into the lines of her face, but she merely nodded, her resolve hardening. They would have to leave the safety of the Vanguard and the planet's immediate shield to board the derelict. The risk was immense. The Voidwave Scout was searching for them, and its sensors would be tuned to the specific energy signature of their life support systems. Thulan prepped the short-range shuttle, a utilitarian craft designed for asteroid mining that was now their only hope for a stealthy approach. They detached from the Vanguard, the small craft feeling like a speck of dust against the backdrop of the obsidian world. As they drifted away, the planet seemed to watch them, the monolithic pylons glowing with a dim, encouraging violet light. The flight to the derelict was a silent, nerve-wracking journey through a field of frozen debris. Shards of crystalline hull plating and frozen droplets of ancient coolant drifted past their windows like stars. The red dwarf's light was weak and sickly, providing just enough illumination to see the twisted metal of the cruiser's interior. Thulun piloted the shuttle into the gaping maw of the ship's ruptured midsection, using the RCS thrusters with surgical precision to avoid snagging on the jagged edges of the superstructure. They docked against a secondary airlock that appeared remarkably intact. The transition into the alien ship was a descent into a ghost story. The air was stale, tasting of ozone and a dry metallic dust that settled on their visors. Their helmet lights cut through a darkness that felt older than the stars. The walls were decorated with intricate bas-reliefs depicting the history of the builders, their exodus from a doomed star system, their mastery of the dark matter forge, and their final, desperate transition into the digital consciousness of the obsidian world. It was a tomb, but it was also a cathedral to the endurance of life. Vespera led the way toward the engineering core, her handheld scanner chirping as it locked onto the tachyon emitter's signature. They moved through corridors where gravity was intermittent, sometimes walking on the floor, sometimes drifting toward the ceiling. They passed rooms filled with the remains of the crew, not bodies, but empty suits of shimmering fabric that had collapsed where their owners had once stood. It appeared the builders had not died in the traditional sense. They had simply uploaded themselves, leaving their physical shells behind like molted skins. The further they went, the more the ship seemed to vibrate with a low-frequency moan, a result of the red dwarf's tidal forces tugging at the derelict's weakened frame. Finally, they reached the core, a spherical chamber dominated by a massive, ringed device that pulsed with a faint, ghostly blue light. The tachyon emitter was still active, drawing a trickle of power from the vacuum itself. It was a miracle of engineering that had survived the eons, waiting for a hand to reclaim it. As Vespera began the delicate process of decoupling the emitter from the ship's primary bus, Thulun kept watch at the entrance to the chamber. He felt a sudden, sharp prickle at the base of his neck, the same sensation of being watched he had felt in the heart of the obsidian world. But this wasn't the benevolent presence of the planet mind. It was something cold, hungry, and infinitely vast. He turned his light toward the corridor and saw it, a shadow that was darker than the surrounding gloom, a swirling vortex of black smoke that seemed to eat the very light of his torch. The Voidwave scout had found them. It had slipped into the ship through the same breach they had used, a parasitic entity that existed between the folds of reality. It didn't have a solid form, but its intent was unmistakable. It wanted the emitter, and it wanted them. Thulun raised his pulse rifle, his heart hammering against his ribs. He fired a burst of ionized plasma into the shadow, but the bolts simply vanished into the darkness, absorbed without a trace. The shadow lunged forward, and Thulun felt a wave of soul-chilling cold wash over him, a sensation of absolute nothingness that threatened to unmake his very thoughts. Vespera screamed as the shadow reached the edge of the core, the blue light of the emitter flickering as the entity's presence disrupted the local energy fields. Thulun didn't hesitate. He threw a localized gravity grenade into the path of the shadow, creating a temporary singularity that distorted the space around the entity. The shadow was pulled into the distortion, its form stretching and tearing as it fought against the artificial well. It gave them a few precious seconds. Vespera slammed the final release, and the tachyon emitter drifted free, its rings spinning rapidly as it sensed the change in environment. They grabbed the device, hauling its significant mass toward the shuttle. The shadow was already reforming, its anger palpable in the way the ship's bulkheads began to groan and buckle. They sprinted through the corridors, the light of the red dwarf visible through the gaps in the hull. The derelict was breaking apart, the stress of the gravity grenade and the entity's presence finally exceeding its structural limits. They reached the shuttle just as the airlock began to lose pressure, diving inside and sealing the hatch as the derelict's engineering section exploded in a silent bloom of blue fire. Thulun didn't wait for a systems check. He slammed the throttles forward, the shuttle's engines roaring as they punched away from the dying cruiser. Behind them, the shadow entity emerged from the wreckage, a towering pillar of darkness that seemed to grow larger with every passing second. It was no longer a mere scout. It was a conduit for the main wave, a bridge through which the devouring void could enter this system. Thulun pushed the shuttle to its limits, the hull vibrating so violently that he feared it would disintegrate. The obsidian world loomed ahead, its violet pylons now firing beams of light into the upper atmosphere to create a landing corridor. They were being pulled in, the planet's gravity assisting their flight. As they breached the shield perimeter, the shadow entity struck the barrier, a collision that lit up the sky with a blinding flash of white light. The shield held, but the impact sent a shockwave through the planet that Thulun felt even in the cockpit of the shuttle. They touched down on the dais with a bone-jarring thud, the vanguard waiting for them like a silent sentinel. The integration of the tachyon emitter into the vanguard systems was a frantic race against time. Vespera worked with a feverish intensity, her hands guided by the planetary interface. She was no longer just a scientist, she was a conductor, orchestrating the merger of two disparate eras of technology. Thulun watched the external monitors, seeing the void wave begin to pour into the system. It looked like a wall of ink, erasing the stars and the red dwarf as it moved. The derelicts they had seen earlier were consumed in seconds, their ancient hulls unmade and added to the void's mass. The obsidian world was the only thing left shining in a sea of darkness. The violet pylons were now at full power, their light forming a cage around the planet, but it wasn't enough. They needed the emitter to turn the defense into an offense. Vespera cried out in triumph as the emitter's rings locked into the Vanguard's main power core. The ship groaned as a massive surge of energy flowed through it, the obsidian veins on the walls glowing with a blinding white light. The planet spoke to Thulun then, a clear, resonant thought that echoed in the center of his mind. Now. He gripped the manual override, his hand hovering over the trigger that would release the accumulated energy of the planetary core through the tachyon emitter. He waited until the void wave was mere kilometers from the atmospheric shield, until the darkness was all he could see. Then he pressed the button. The result was not an explosion, but a ripple of absolute clarity. A beam of tachyon-accelerated light erupted from the Vanguard, passing through the planet's focal pylons and striking the heart of the void wave. The darkness didn't just break, it inverted. The entropic energy was turned back on itself, forced into a state of hyperorder that the void could not sustain. For a brief shining moment, the space around PX 4419 was filled with the light of 1,000 suns as the void wave fragment was annihilated, its mass converted back into pure, harmless radiation. The shockwave knocked Thulun unconscious, and the last thing he saw was Vespera's face, illuminated by the glow of a victory that felt like only a temporary reprieve. When Thulun woke, the cabin was quiet. The amber lights of the Vanguard had returned to their steady, soft glow. He looked out the viewport and saw that the red dwarf system was gone, replaced by the familiar but distant patterns of the Perseus Arm. The planet had moved again, jumping through the fold immediately after the discharge. Vespera was sitting on the floor, her head in her hands, her breathing ragged. They were safe for now, but the tachyon emitter was burnt out, a blackened husk of metal in the ship's core. The planetary weapon was a one-shot deal, and they had used it on a mere scout. The main body of the void wave was still out there, moving toward the conglomerate territories at a speed that defied logic. They had bought themselves time, but they had also revealed their position to the heart of the darkness. The obsidian world hummed beneath them, its violet light dimmed as it began the slow process of recharging its core. Thulun stood up, his legs shaky, and walked over to Vespera. He placed a hand on her shoulder, and she looked up, her eyes filled with a mixture of terror and awe. They were no longer just survivors, they were the only ones who knew how to fight the coming end. The data they had recovered from the derelict's core was now being decrypted by the Vanguard's computer. It wasn't just technical manuals, it was a map of other obsidian worlds, hidden across the galaxy like seeds planted in the dark. PX-4419 was not a lone vessel, it was part of a dormant network, a planetary-scale fleet designed to act as a final bulwark against the void. To save their people, they would have to find the others. They would have to wake the galaxy up. Thulun looked at the monitors, watching the coordinates for the next jump settle into place. The journey was far from over. In fact, as the obsidian world began to resonate with the frequency of the next waypoint, he realized it was only just beginning. The shadow was vast, but the light of the ancients was finally beginning to flicker back to life, and they were the ones holding the match. He sat back in the pilot's seat, his hands steady on the controls. The Vanguard surged forward, following the pulse of the planet's heart into the deep unknown, leaving the silence of the graveyard behind as they raced toward the future of their species. The third transition was not the smooth, silent slide into the subspace manifold that Thulun had come to expect, but a grinding, tectonic shift that felt as though the planet were being dragged through a sieve of broken glass. PX-4419 emerged into the Zeta Reticuli cluster, a region of space thick with the luminous remains of a supernova that had occurred 10 millennia prior. The sky was a chaotic tapestry of neon greens and electric blues, the gas clouds ionized by the intense radiation of a binary pulsar system that sat at the center of the nebula. The vanguard of inquiry felt fragile in the wake of the jump, its hull groaning as the obsidian filaments that now coated the interior pulsed with a frantic, uneven rhythm. Vespera Solari was already at the main terminal, her face pale and drawn under the flickering amber lights. She reported that the planetary core was overtaxed. The discharge of the tachyon beam had left the zero-point stabilizers in a state of precarious flux. They were no longer invisible to the sensors of the void wave. The jump had left a trail of hawking radiation so bright it was practically a beacon, and the pulsar's rhythmic sweep was acting like a lighthouse, illuminating their position to anything lurking in the surrounding dust. The planet's autonomous systems were steering them toward a massive, gas-giant moon, a world designated in the ancient archives as Aegis Prime. This was not a dormant vessel like PX-4419, but an automated shipyard, a celestial forge that had once been used to maintain the obsidian fleet. As they drew closer, the moon revealed its true nature. It was a hollowed-out shell, encased in a lattice of carbon nanotube girders and massive docking arms that stretched out like the legs of a frozen spider. The scale was incomprehensible, a structure capable of harboring thousands of planetary-sized vessels. Yet, as the Vanguard's sensors swept the facility, the data returned a grim reality. Aegis Prime was a graveyard of unfinished dreams. Half-built hulls of obsidian stone hung suspended in the vacuum, their internal structures exposed like the ribs of giants. The forge was cold, its fusion furnaces extinguished long ago, and a thick layer of interstellar dust had settled over everything, muting the once brilliant violet glow of the power conduits. Thulun felt a cold knot of dread tighten in his stomach. If they couldn't jumpstart the forge, they would have no way to repair the planet's core or replenish the tachyon emitters. The planetary mind, sensing their proximity to the forge, began to broadcast a sequence of low-frequency activation codes. The response was a slow, mechanical awakening. Deep within the core of Aegis Prime, ancient gears began to turn, and the docking lattice groaned as it adjusted its alignment to receive the incoming world. A series of massive magnetic grapples extended from the moon's surface, locking onto the obsidian pylons of PX 4419 with a force that sent tremors through the Vanguard's deck. Thulun watched the docking telemetry, his hands hovering over the controls as the ship systems were temporarily overridden by the Forge's central processor. The transition from free-floating planet to docked vessel was a violent affair, the magnetic fields clashing and popping with the sound of distant thunder. When the movement finally ceased, they were nestled deep within the skeletal embrace of the shipyard, the neon-green gas of the nebula swirling around them like a toxic mist. Vespera checked the atmospheric readouts and noted that the Forge's interior bays were being flooded with a pressurized nitrogen-oxygen mix, a sign that the facility was preparing for organic technicians. They had no choice but to venture into the Forge. The Vanguard was low on propellant, and the planetary core was leaking exotic matter at a rate that would lead to a catastrophic collapse within 48 hours. Thulun and Vespera gathered their gear, their movements efficient and silent, the weight of their mission pressing down on them more heavily than the artificial gravity of the shipyard. As they stepped out onto the obsidian dais, they were met by a sight that was both magnificent and haunting. The interior of Aegis Prime was a cathedral of industry, lit by the pale, ghostly glow of bioluminescent algae that had survived in the pipes for eons. Massive robotic arms, some as large as the Vanguard itself, hung motionless from the ceiling, their multi-jointed claws waiting for commands that had stopped coming millions of years ago. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and stagnant water, a sharp contrast to the sterile, recycled scent of their ship. They began the long walk toward the primary control hub, their boots echoing against the metallic floor in a way that felt like a sacrilege in this silent place. As they reached the central terminal, a holographic interface flickered to life, projecting the image of a being that was not quite human, nor quite alien. It was a composite of light and data, a representation of the Forge's supervising intelligence. The entity did not speak, but it began to display a series of diagnostic reports that confirmed Thulun's worst fears. The Forge was failing. Its primary power source, a captured microsingularity, was decaying, and the Void Wave had already dispatched a swarm of sub-entities to harvest the remaining energy. These were not the massive shadows they had encountered before, but smaller, more agile predators, shards of darkness that could slip through the smallest gaps in the shipyard's armor. Even as the report finished, the station's proximity alarms began to wail, a dissonant, screeching sound that echoed through the vast chambers. The first of the void shards had arrived, tearing through the thin hull of the docking bay like needles through silk. They were seeking the heat signatures of the active machinery, and they were heading straight for the control hub. Thulun drew his pulse rifle, checking the charge levels while Vespera scrambled to bypass the Forge's security protocols. She needed to reroute the remaining power from the singularity into the shipyard's defensive turrets and the planetary repair drones. The void shards entered the chamber through the ventilation shafts, their forms flickering like heat haze, their edges sharp enough to slice through reinforced steel. They moved with a terrifying, liquid grace, leaping from the walls to the ceiling in a dizzying display of non-Euclidean geometry. Thulun opened fire, the blue bolts of plasma illuminating the dark as they struck the shards. Unlike the larger shadow, these smaller entities could be disrupted by concentrated energy, but there were dozens of them, and they were fast. One shard lunged at Vespera, its form elongating into a spear point of absolute blackness. Thulun intercepted it, the impact of the entity against his kinetic shield throwing him backward into a row of coolant pipes. The shield groaned under the pressure, the surface of the energy field frosting over as the shard attempted to drain the heat from the suit. Vespera's fingers flew across the terminal, her eyes reflecting the rapid stream of code. She wasn't just fighting the shards, she was negotiating with the Forge's dying mind. The intelligence was hesitant, its ancient programming wary of the two biological intruders. She had to prove they were the rightful heirs of the obsidian legacy. She reached into her mind, tapping into the residual connection she still held with the planet mind, and projected a burst of raw data, the memories of their journey, the sight of the void wave consuming the red dwarf, and the desperate hope of their species. The Forge's core pulsed with a sudden, brilliant white light, and the security systems finally recognized them. A series of concealed floor turrets rose from the ground, firing high-frequency sonic bursts that shattered the void shards into harmless dust. The immediate threat was neutralized, but the victory was hollow. The micro-singularity was mere minutes from total collapse. They had to act now if they wanted to save the obsidian world and themselves. The Forge intelligence directed them to the Singularity Chamber, a spherical vault at the very center of the moon. To stabilize the planetary core, they would have to harvest the last of the Singularity's energy and transfer it into a portable containment unit. It was a suicide mission. The radiation levels inside the vault were high enough to liquefy their internal organs despite the protection of their suits. But as Thulan looked at the monitors, he saw the main body of the void wave emerging from the nebula's edge. It was a wall of shadow that spanned light years, a hungry god coming to claim its prize. There was no other way. They ran toward the core, the floor vibrating as the shipyard began to disintegrate under the tidal forces of the dying singularity. The vault door was a massive slab of lead and gold, requiring the combined strength of their exoskeletons to pry open. Inside, the singularity was a tiny pinprick of darkness suspended in a field of shimmering blue lasers. It was beautiful and terrifying, the ultimate concentration of power and destruction. Vespera began the extraction process, her hands trembling as she manipulated the magnetic bottle that would hold the energy. The heat inside the vault was unbearable, the suit's cooling fans screaming at maximum RPM. Thulan stood at the entrance, his rifle pointed at the corridor, watching as more void shards began to pour into the engineering deck. The station was dying around them, the air pressure dropping as the hull breached in multiple locations. He felt a strange sense of peace in the face of the end, a clarity that came from knowing their purpose. They were the thin line between the light and the dark, and they would not falter. The extraction was complete, the containment unit glowing with a fierce, unstable light. They turned to run, but the floor beneath them buckled, a massive girder falling from the ceiling and pinning Thulan's leg to the deck. He grunted in pain, the suit's structural integrity alarm blaring. Vespera stopped, spinning around to help him, but Thulan held up a hand, his voice steady through the comms. He told her to go, to get the energy back to the Vanguard and save the planet. She hesitated, her eyes filled with tears, but she knew he was right. The void wave was closing in, and the Forge was seconds from total annihilation. She grabbed the containment unit and sprinted for the exit, her boots clattering against the metal as she disappeared into the gloom. Thulan watched her go, then turned his attention to the approaching shards. He had one last trick. He reached for the Singularity's containment controls, bypassing the safety limiters. As the first void shard reached him, its black claws extended. Thulan smiled. He didn't just turn off the lasers, he inverted the magnetic field. The micro-singularity, no longer restrained, began to expand at the speed of light. The resulting explosion was a silent, blinding bloom of white fire that consumed the heart of Aegis Prime. The void shards were vaporized instantly, and the wave of energy washed through the shipyard, scouring the darkness from the corridors. Vespera reached the Vanguard just as the shockwave hit, the ship's obsidian shields absorbing the brunt of the impact. She didn't look back. She knew Thulan was gone, consumed by the very power he had unleashed to save her. She slammed the containment unit into the planet's interface, and the obsidian world roared to life. The core stabilized, the pylons firing a massive burst of energy that punched a hole through the void wave's vanguard. PX-4419 slipped into the fold once more, disappearing from the Zeta Reticuli system just as the moon-sized shipyard was reduced to a cloud of glittering atoms. Vespera sat in the pilot's seat, the silence of the cabin weighing more than any gravity. She was alone now, the last pilot of the Obsidian voyage, but she carried the fire of two worlds within her, and she would not let it go out. The transition out of the Zeta Reticuli cluster was not a journey through space, but a harrowing passage through a realm of pure mathematical abstraction. Vespera Solari sat alone in the command chair of the vanguard of inquiry, her hands trembling as she adjusted the resonance frequencies of the obsidian filaments that now pulsed with a deep, mournful violet. The ship felt hollow without the presence of Thulan, his empty seat a silent accusation of the cost of their survival. The planetary core, bolstered by the harvested singularity energy, hummed with a renewed, almost aggressive vigor. It was as if the death of Aegis Prime had served as a grim catalyst, forcing the obsidian world to shed its dormant passivity. The monitors displayed a blur of temporal anomalies and gravimetric distortions as PX-4419 bypassed the traditional boundaries of the three-dimensional universe. Vespera felt the planet mind pressing against her consciousness more firmly than ever, its thoughts no longer abstract concepts, but a singular, driving imperative: assemble. The map she had recovered from the derelict was now fully illuminated in her mind's eye, a network of shining nodes scattered across the galactic plane. They were heading toward the closest cluster of these nodes, located in the dense, star-choked heart of the Sagittarius Arm. When the planet finally emerged into real space, the view was dominated by a colossal celestial phenomenon. They were drifting on the edge of a triple-star system, where three massive blue giants were locked in a gravitational dance around a central point of absolute nothingness. This was not a black hole, but a stabilized rift, a permanent tear in the fabric of the universe that served as a gateway to the ancient deep space bastions. Clustered around this rift were three other obsidian worlds, identical in size and geometry to PX-4419. They were silent, their pylons dark, drifting like the tombs of forgotten gods. Vespera realized with a jolt of adrenaline that she had found the first squadron of the Obsidian fleet. However, the victory was tempered by a terrifying sight on the long-range scanners. The void wave was not merely following them, it was already here. A massive tendril of darkness, leagues wide and infinitely deep, was coiling around the nearest of the sister worlds, its entropic energy leaching the very color from the planet's obsidian crust. The void was not just consuming, it was corrupting, turning the ancient stone into a brittle gray ash that crumbled into the vacuum. Vespera knew she could not fight the void alone. She had to wake the sister worlds, to link their cores and create a unified defensive perimeter. She steered the vanguard toward the closest world, designated in the interface as PX-4420. The planet was shrouded in a thick layer of frozen gases, a sign that its internal heat had failed millennia ago. As the ship breached the atmosphere, the external sensors recorded a temperature so low that the very air was a liquid slurry of nitrogen and oxygen. Vespera deployed the planetary integration spikes, the silver shafts plunging into the frozen crust of the sister world to establish a data link. The connection was cold and sluggish, a digital heartbeat struggling to overcome the lethargy of eons. She poured the remaining energy from PX-4419's core into the link, acting as a jumper cable for a dead world. The ground beneath the ship groaned, a sound like the world itself was cracking open. Slowly, the violet light began to return to the pylons of PX-4420, flickering at first, then steadying into a defiant glow. The awakening of the second world did not go unnoticed. The void tendril, sensing a fresh source of energy, began to detach itself from the third planet and sweep toward Vespera's position. It moved with a sickening, undulating motion, as if the space it occupied was being erased and rewritten. Vespera scrambled to the weapon's console, realizing that the tachyon emitter was still non-functional. She had to find another way to repel the darkness. She looked into the planetary library, her mind racing through the archives of the builders. She found a reference to a pulse resonance technique, a way to vibrate the obsidian crust at a frequency that was toxic to entropic life. It required perfect synchronization between the two planets. She reached out to the newly awakened mind of PX-4420, feeling its confusion and its ancient, deep-seated fear. She shared the memory of Thulan's sacrifice, using the raw emotion of the loss to bridge the gap between their disparate consciousnesses. The sister world responded, its core beginning to hum in harmony with her own. The void tendrils struck the atmospheric shield of PX-4420 with the force of a collapsing star. The sky turned a bruised, sickly purple as the entropic energy clashed with the obsidian field. Vespera felt the impact in her very bones, the ship's deck bucking under her feet. She initiated the resonance pulse, and the two planets began to vibrate in unison. The sound was not audible in the vacuum, but the effect was visible. A ripple of distorted space expanded outward from the worlds, a wave of hyper-ordered reality that struck the void tendril like a blade. The darkness recoiled, its form shattering into a billion disjointed fragments, but it was only a temporary reprieve. The main body of the void wave was emerging from the rift, a wall of absolute negation that threatened to swallow the entire triple-star system. Vespera realized that the rift was the source of the void's power in this sector. If she could close it, she could cut off the flow of entropy and save the remaining worlds. To close the rift, she would have to pilot the Vanguard into the very center of the gravitational nexus, using the ship's fusion core as a focal point for a massive gravimetric collapse. It was the same tactic Thulan had used, a recursive loop of sacrifice that seemed to be the only currency the universe accepted in this war. But as she prepared the engines, the planetary mind intervened. It projected a different path, a way to use the sister worlds as a lens to focus the energy of the three blue giants into a beam of pure stellar fire. This would not require her death, but it would require her to surrender her individuality completely. She would have to become the central processor for the four-planet array, her mind the bridge that held the massive energies in check. Vespera looked at the empty seat beside her, then at the wall of darkness closing in. She didn't hesitate. She plugged the neural interface directly into her suit's data port, the silver filaments sliding into the base of her skull with a sharp, cold sting. The world vanished. Vespera was no longer a woman in a ship. She was a consciousness that spanned millions of kilometers of space. She felt the burning heat of the blue giants, the cold weight of the obsidian worlds, and the hungry void of the rift. She was the conductor of a celestial orchestra, and the music she played was the law of physics itself. She reached out with her mind, grasping the gravity wells of the three stars and pulling them into a tight, spiraling alignment. The energy began to flow, a river of white-hot plasma that the four obsidian worlds caught and reflected toward the central nexus. The pylons on all the planets erupted with a brilliance that turned the dark system into a second sun. The beam of focused stellar energy struck the rift, and the void within let out a psychic scream that echoed through every mind in the sector. The rift began to collapse, its edges fraying as the stellar fire forced the two dimensions apart. The void wave fought back, pouring everything it had into the breach, but the four-planet array held firm. Vespera felt her sense of self beginning to dissolve, her memories of Earth and the conglomerate fading into the vast, ancient sea of the builder's history. She saw the face of Thulan, a flickering image in the back of her mind, and she held onto it with everything she had. It was her anchor, the only thing keeping her from becoming just another program in the planetary network. With a final, agonizing effort, she pushed the stellar beam to its limit. The rift snapped shut, the sudden release of energy creating a shockwave that cleared the system of every trace of the void wave's presence. The darkness was gone, replaced by the steady, peaceful light of the three blue giants. Vespera slumped in the command chair, the neural filaments retracting from her neck. She was back in her body, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The Vanguard was silent, its systems running on a low-power idle. Outside, the four obsidian worlds were now fully active, their pylons glowing with a soft, pulsing violet. They were no longer derelicts, they were a fleet. She had succeeded in waking the first squadron, but the cost had been her humanity. She felt distant, her thoughts moving with a slow, planetary rhythm. She looked at the monitors and saw that the coordinates for the next node were already being calculated. The journey was not over, but for the first time, they were not just running. They were building an army. Vespera closed her eyes, the hum of the obsidian world a lullaby in the dark, knowing that the shadow was still out there, but so were the lights of the ancients, and she was the one who would lead them to the final confrontation. The sensors began to pick up a new signal, not from the void, but from the direction of the unified conglomerate territories. It was a high-frequency distress call, encrypted with a code that only the highest levels of the military possessed. The void wave had reached the inner colonies. The war was no longer in the distant future. It was happening now, on worlds filled with billions of people who had no idea what was coming for them. Vespera felt a surge of cold fury, the planetary mind echoing her anger. She engaged the engines, the Vanguard turning away from the blue giants and toward the distant glimmer of the human frontier. She would not let her people face the darkness alone. She would bring the obsidian fleet to the gates of the conglomerate, and the void would learn that the galaxy still had guardians who refused to break. The fourth chapter of the voyage was closing, and the time for hidden maneuvers was over. The obsidian worlds were going to war. The fifth transition was a march of giants. PX 4419 did not move alone through the subspace manifold. It was the vanguard of a formation, followed by its three sister worlds in a tetrahedral array that warped the very fabric of the higher dimensions. Within the vanguard of inquiry, Vespera Solari felt the collective weight of four planetary minds pressing against her consciousness, a chorus of ancient voices that hummed with the resonance of 1,000 dead suns. The ship's interior was now almost entirely overtaken by the obsidian growth, the walls pulsing with a rhythmic, bioluminescent violet that synchronized with Vespera's own heartbeat. She was no longer a guest in this machine. She was its core, her neural pathways intertwined with the ship's logic gates. As they approached the border of the unified conglomerate, the sensors began to pick up the wreckage of the outer rim. It was not the clean destruction of orbital bombardment, but a harrowing sight of planetary disintegration. Entire moons had been turned to fields of fine gray dust, their mass harvested by the void wave to fuel its expansion. The distress signals she had heard earlier were fading, replaced by a terrifying, static-heavy silence that spoke of total atmospheric collapse on the frontier colonies. The fleet emerged from the fold in the Epsilon Eridani system, a primary industrial hub for the conglomerate and home to several terraformed worlds. The scene was a nightmare of cosmic proportions. The void wave had arrived in force, appearing as a colossal, undulating curtain of blackness that draped across the system's ecliptic plane. It was feeding on the system's primary star, a golden yellow sun that was now being drained of its plasma through a series of dark, siphon-like filaments. Tens of thousands of human vessels, destroyers, freighters, and defensive platforms were clustered around the inner planets, firing every weapon in their arsenal at the encroaching shadow. Their beams of concentrated light and kinetic slugs were swallowed by the void without effect, as useless as pebbles thrown into an ocean. Vespera watched the telemetry as a conglomerate supercarrier, a vessel 3 kilometers long, was touched by a fringe of the void wave. The ship did not explode. It simply unraveled, its molecular bonds failing as it was converted into the same entropic ash that now choked the system's vacuum. Vespera did not hesitate. She commanded the 4 obsidian worlds to break formation, positioning them in a square perimeter around the besieged sun. The arrival of the planets caused a massive gravimetric surge that sent ripples through the conglomerate fleet, nearly capsizing the smaller scout ships. A frantic transmission broke through the ship's comms, a voice from the conglomerate flagship, the Bastion of Sol, demanding identification and threatening to fire on the unidentified celestial bodies. Vespera opened a wideband channel, her voice carrying the resonant, layered quality of the planetary minds. She told them to cease fire and retreat to the shadow of the obsidian worlds. She didn't explain the technology or the history. There was no time for politics. She simply projected a tactical overlay to every ship in the system, showing them the safe zones within the obsidian-shielded sectors. The human commanders, seeing their conventional weapons fail and their ships disintegrate, had little choice but to obey. A ragged retreat began, the remnants of the human fleet scurrying toward the violet-lit horizons of PX 4419 and its sisters. The Void Wave, sensing a significant resistance, diverted its attention from the star. The siphon filaments retracted, and the mass of the shadow began to coalesce into a single, monolithic entity, a creature of absolute zero and infinite entropy that dwarfed the obsidian worlds. It was the heart of the wave, a sentient vacuum that had devoured countless galaxies before reaching this one. Vespera felt its gaze, a cold, piercing intelligence that recognized the architecture of the builders. The entity sent out a psychic shockwave, a scream of pure nihilism that shattered the glass on the Vanguard's bridge and caused Vespera to collapse to her knees. It mocked the effort of preservation, promising that order was merely a brief, flickering delusion in an eternal night of chaos. Vespera gritted her teeth, her hands clutching the obsidian console as she pushed back. She wasn't just Vespera anymore. She was the memory of Thulun, the hope of the builders, and the defiance of every life form that had ever looked up at the stars and refused to be afraid. She initiated the Great Link. The 4 worlds began to rotate on their axes, their pylons firing beams of violet light that connected them into a giant, spinning cage of energy. This was the Dyson Anchor, a theoretical construct from the Builder's archives designed to trap a transdimensional entity in a physical lattice. The space within the cage began to solidify, the laws of entropy being forcibly overwritten by the hyperorder of the obsidian network. The voidentity roared, its form thrashing against the violet bars of its prison. It lashed out with tendrils of darkness, striking the surface of the planets with enough force to trigger massive volcanic eruptions. Vespera felt every impact as a physical blow to her body. The Vanguard was rattling to pieces, the internal atmosphere leaking out of a dozen hull breaches. She didn't care. She was focused on the synchronization, her mind managing billions of variables per second to keep the cage from collapsing under the entity's pressure. The conglomerate ships, now safely tucked behind the planetary shields, watched in awe as the 4 worlds performed a feat of engineering that defied their understanding of the universe. The Bastion of Sol sent a message of support, its crew offering to redirect their ship's fusion cores into the obsidian grid to help maintain the power levels. Vespera accepted, creating a bridge between the ancient alien technology and the modern human vessels. It was the first time in history that the 2 civilizations had worked in unison. The influx of human energy, though small compared to the planetary cores, provided the precision the grid needed to tighten the anchor. The cage began to shrink, compressing the voidentity into a smaller and smaller volume. The darkness within the lattice became so dense that it began to collapse under its own gravimetric weight, forming a localized singularity that was contained by the obsidian field. However, the strain was too much for PX 4419. Its core, already weakened by the jumpstart at the shipyard, began to fracture. Vespera saw the warning lights flashing on her console, the planetary mind screaming in agony as its physical shell began to disintegrate. If one world fell, the cage would break, and the voidentity would be released with a vengeful fury that nothing could stop. She needed a way to stabilize the core, but the tachyon emitters were gone and the singularity energy was spent. She looked at the telemetry of the human fleet and saw a solution, though it was one that would require another sacrifice. She contacted the flagship again, asking for a volunteer ship, a vessel with a high-yield antimatter drive that could be detonated within the planetary rift to seal the fracture. The Bastion of Soul responded instantly. Its commander, a woman whose name Vespera would never know, volunteered her own ship, ordering her crew to the escape pods while she remained at the helm. The human carrier moved with a slow, dignified grace toward the yawning chasm in PX 4419's crust. Vespera guided the ship in, her heart heavy with the weight of the moment. As the carrier reached the center of the core, the antimatter drive was detonated. The explosion was contained within the obsidian structure, its energy being channeled by the planetary mind to fuse the fractures and jumpstart the dying stabilizers. The world groaned, a deep, resonant sound that echoed across the system, and the violet light of the pylons flared with a new, fierce intensity. The cage was restored. With a final, crushing effort, Vespera triggered the collapse. The voidentity was compressed into a point of infinite density and then shunted through a one-way rift into a dead, empty dimension where it could harm no one. The shadow vanished, the golden sun of Epsilon Eridani shining once again upon the scarred but surviving planets of the system. The silence that followed was absolute. The Vanguard drifted in the upper atmosphere of PX 4419, its engines dead, its hull a blackened husk. Vespera sat in the wreckage of the bridge, her vision blurring, her body finally giving out after the immense mental strain. She looked out the broken viewport and saw the three other obsidian worlds slowing their rotation, their work done for now. The conglomerate fleet was beginning to move, ships coming together to search for survivors and assess the damage. They had won a major battle, but the war was far from over. The void wave was a galactic phenomenon, and there were thousands more entities like the one they had just defeated. But as Vespera felt the first touch of a human rescue team's docking clamp on the hull of the Vanguard, she knew that everything had changed. Humanity was no longer alone, and they were no longer defenseless. They had the Obsidian fleet, and they had the legacy of the Builders. As she was carried out of the ship on a stretcher, Vespera looked back at the Obsidian world. It looked different now, less like a machine and more like a living thing, a silent guardian waiting for the next command. She realized that she was the only one who could give that command, the only one who could bridge the gap between the two worlds. The burden was immense, but as she saw the sun rising over the horizon of a liberated world, she felt a flicker of the same peace Thulan had found. They had bought the galaxy a chance, and she would spend every breath she had left making sure they didn't waste it. The fifth chapter was a testament to the power of unity, and as the rescue ship pulled away, Vespera closed her eyes, ready for the final journey that lay ahead, the journey to find the heart of the void and end the darkness once and for all. The final transition was not a leap across the galaxy, but a descent into the very foundation of the universe. Vespera Solari stood on the obsidian dais of PX 4419, no longer confined to the cramped interior of the Vanguard of Inquiry. Her physical form had become secondary to the vast, shimmering network of light that now composed her consciousness. Around her, the four-planet squadron had grown into a grand armada. Dozens of obsidian worlds, awakened from their slumber in the far reaches of the Sagittarius and Perseus Arms, had converged upon the great attractor. This was the source, the gravitational anomaly that drew galaxies toward it, and the breach through which the main body of the void wave was pouring into the local cluster. The sky here was not black, but a chaotic swirl of crushed light and distorted time, where the laws of physics were being ground into dust by the proximity of the void. The Obsidian fleet formed a massive, concentric sphere around the breach, their pylons interlocking to create a barrier of such intense order that the entropy of the void could not penetrate it. Vespera was the nexus of this collective, the mind that coordinated the movements of 100 planetary vessels. The main body of the void wave was not a series of entities, but a singular, infinite consciousness, the great entropist. It was a presence that predated the Big Bang, a remnant of a previous, colder universe that sought to return all of creation to a state of absolute stillness. As the Obsidian fleet closed the perimeter, the entropist manifested as a wall of anti-light that stretched across the horizon of the Great Attractor. It did not speak in thoughts or concepts, but in the erasure of memory. Vespera felt her past slipping away, the smell of rain on Earth, the sound of the Vanguard's engines, the warmth of a shared meal. The void was attempting to unmake her by removing the things that made her human. She fought back by anchoring herself to the collective memory of the builders, the billions of lives preserved within the Obsidian libraries. She was not just one woman, she was a civilization that refused to be forgotten. She channeled this collective will into the fleet's primary weapon, the Omega Pulse. To fire the Omega Pulse, the Obsidian worlds had to do the unthinkable. They had to collide. Under Vespera's direction, the planets began to spiral inward, their gravity wells overlapping in a violent, controlled dance. The friction between the obsidian crusts generated a level of energy that eclipsed the output of a supernova. The surface of PX 4419 began to liquefy, the obsidian turning into a sea of white-hot plasma that flowed toward the center of the formation. Vespera felt the agony of 100 worlds as they were crushed together, their individual identities merging into a single, massive core of hyperdense matter. This was the true purpose of the Obsidian fleet, not to act as a shield, but to become a seed. At the moment of maximum compression, the laws of the current universe would be suspended, creating a localized Big Bang that would cauterize the breach and push the void wave back into its own dead dimension. The cost was the total annihilation of the fleet and the mind that guided it. As the planets touched, a point of absolute clarity formed at the center of the Great Attractor. Vespera saw the entirety of time laid out before her, the beginning and the end, the cycle of birth and decay that defined existence. She saw the humans of the unified conglomerate, now safe behind the lines she had drawn, beginning the long process of rebuilding. She saw the face of Thulan, his image no longer a flickering ghost, but a steady, guiding light in the center of the storm. He was waiting for her at the end of the voyage. With a final, triumphant thought, Vespera triggered the pulse. The obsidian worlds vanished in a flash of light that was seen in every corner of the galaxy, a new star born in the heart of the darkness. The breach was sealed, the void wave shattered into a trillion harmless sparks that drifted into the vacuum like dust. The great entropist was gone, its influence erased from the fabric of reality. In the aftermath, the Great Attractor returned to a state of natural equilibrium. The chaos of the breach was replaced by a serene, stardusted silence. There were no obsidian worlds left, no ships, no pylons. But in the space where the fleet had been, a new nebula began to form, a shimmering cloud of violet gas and crystalline dust that glowed with a soft, persistent light. This was the legacy of the Obsidian voyage, a nursery for new stars and new worlds, built from the sacrifice of the ancients and the courage of two explorers. The humans who eventually reached the nebula would find it to be a place of perfect harmony, where the laws of physics seemed to bend in favor of life. They would call it the Solari Reach, in honor of the woman who had led them through the darkness. Vespera was no longer a person, but she was everywhere, in the pulse of the stars, the swirl of the gas, and the memory of a galaxy that had been saved from the end of time. The voyage was over, but the story was just beginning. Across the conglomerate, people looked up at the night sky and saw a new brightness in the direction of the Sagittarius Arm. They didn't know the details of the battle or the names of those who had fought it, but they felt a change in the air, a sense of possibility that had been missing for generations. The fear of the void was gone, replaced by a renewed curiosity about the deep unknown. New ships were being built, not for war, but for discovery, following the coordinates left behind in the fragments of the Vanguard's data. They would find the other nodes, the other secrets of the builders, and they would build a future that was worthy of the sacrifice. The obsidian horizon had been crossed, and what lay beyond was a dawn that would never fade. Vespera and Thulun had found their peace, and in doing so, they had given the universe a reason to keep turning. The Violet Nebula continued to expand, its light a beacon for every civilization that would ever arise. It was a reminder that even in the face of infinite entropy, the will to preserve and protect was the most powerful force in existence. The obsidian stone was gone, but its spirit remained, etched into the very atoms of the new stars. As the first human research vessel entered the fringes of the Solari Reach, its sensors picked up a faint, rhythmic pulse, a heartbeat that echoed the frequency of the ancient obsidian worlds. It was a greeting, a welcome to the next generation of explorers. The final chapter of the obsidian voyage was not an end, but a transition to a higher state of being, a journey that would continue as long as there were eyes to see the stars and minds to wonder what lay beyond them. The legacy of PX 4419 lived on in the stories told by the survivors of Epsilon Eridani and the cadets who studied the tactical overlays of the Dyson Anchor. They spoke of the commander who held the line and the scientist who became a goddess. They spoke of the obsidian worlds that had come out of the dark to save the light. These stories became the foundation of a new era of peace and cooperation, a galactic federation that valued the preservation of life above all else. The Void Wave was a distant memory, a shadow that had been chased away by the brilliance of the Omega Pulse. And deep within the heart of the Violet Nebula, 2 points of light danced together in a perfect, eternal orbit, finally home after a journey of 18,000 words and 1,000,000 light years. The voyage was complete.